donation. Okay, straw man arguments. I saw this morning. I went through Cam Guthrie's Twitter feed, and he was saying, you have to listen to the person on the right. This is the leader of the NDP in Manitoba. His name is Wab Kinew, okay? And he interrupted the new minister being sworn in when the new minister said the intent of residential schools was actually good. And he creates a straw man argument. He says the intent of the residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child. And then he bases his entire argument on that. And the minister is a bravo minister, because he stood there and he said, I look forward to working with you, because he's not gonna win this argument, so he just gets out of it. He just, bam, right out. No problems. Great. Wonderful response. And I think that he handled it well. The NDP leader did not. He's getting absolute praise all over social media. Everybody's like, oh, this is the person who knows what he's talking about. Now, the new minister, Minister Alan Lagamore, and I've got it, Lagadimore. I've got it terribly wrong, sir, and I apologize. But the new minister is a Métis man. So this is a very interesting situation. So I'll read the National Post headline and then show you the exchange, and then I'll show you why it's a straw man. Okay, here we go. Wab Kinew interrupts first remarks by Manitoba's new Indigenous Relations Minister. Minutes after he was sworn in, Alan Lagamore, sorry if I got that wrong, who is Métis, told reporters the original intention behind residential schools was not all bad. Okay, first I'll show you this. This is a Maclean's article from 2013, a couple of years ago. The man wrongly attributed with uttering "kill the Indian" in the child. Okay, and the man's name is Duncan Campbell Scott. Scott is commonly and wrongly attributed with uttering the goal to kill the Indian in the child, a phrase that belongs to an American military officer, but rightly associated with the expansion of the Indian residential school system in the 1920s and the 1930s. Ably analyzes Scott's poetry and policies, struggling with the paradox of his life. How could a poet write so empathetically about Aboriginal people and co-sign their children to merciless assimilation, abuse, and death? At first, the reader will find, Ably tries to answer this by summoning the poet bureaucrat's ghost to speak for himself. The ghostly Scott has feelings, wit, and a great memory for verse. This is a work of non-fiction greased with a significant artistic license. In each chapter, Ably covers historical ground and pursues a dialogue with Scott about it. They banter, argue, and scold. At first, the reader will find this preposterous. As the pages turn, however, what seemed like a cheap narrative ploy becomes a serious method to understand Scott on his own terms. Scott gets a real chance to explain how someone well-meaning could order the destruction of Aboriginal families and culture. For Scott, the schools were about extending Canadian citizenship, not colonialism. Okay, there's context is what I'm trying to get at here, and I'm not trying to forgive things. I think that their intention was maybe good. I think that their method was horrific. Okay, I couldn't imagine somebody coming to me and taking my child, but I couldn't imagine 50% of my children dying at birth. And I couldn't imagine a situation, well, I could imagine, but we don't live in a situation where women get pregnant or women could get pregnant every time you engage in intercourse, right? So like in the modern world, pregnancy is generally planned, right? Like most of the time. I wonder what the stats are on that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. In the modern world, pregnancy is planned and you have 1 or 2 children. In the time frame that we're talking about back then, you would have 5 to 10 children and maybe more, maybe less, but maybe more, right? And so in that context, the situation was also that people were encouraged to give up their children to encouraged through money, encouraged through incentives, encouraged through all sorts of things. So like there is a context here. The intent of the Canadian government and the intent of the Catholic Church, I don't believe. And again, their methods were horrific. I'm not trying to excuse the methods. I'm not trying to excuse what actually happened and the abuse that happened, but it happened by men, not government institution. And men and women, people. It happened by people. But I don't think the intent was bad. The intent was they were looking at a modern world. They wanted to modernize quickly. They were watching other nations modernize, and they didn't want to get left behind. And again, I'm not excusing their method, but the times were different, fundamentally different. People were poor. They couldn't afford their children, and the children kept coming. Like, children weren't seen then as the way they're seen now. It's a very different thing, right? And attributing our thoughts to these people is wrong. Okay, and that's exactly the argument that Wab Canoe is making here. Okay, here's the exchange. We'll watch all of it because I think it's worthwhile.
The residential school system was designed to take Indigenous children and give them the skills and abilities they would need to fit into the society as it moved forward. So,
I think that was the policy. You think that was the intention of the federal government to do that? To just give them.
I am an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I listen to the stories of the survivors.
yes.
And I cannot accept you saying what you just said about residential schools. It was the express intent of residential schools to kill the Indian in the child. It is not cultural relativism. It is not revisionist history for us to say that that was wrong. Any right-minded person at the time should have known that it was wrong. Many did know and speak up against it. And if you are to take your job that you've been appointed to by Mr. Pallister seriously, starting today, you have to change that thing.
I look forward to working with you in the future.
So he says any right-minded person back then should have known it was wrong. Many did know it was wrong. What about people who know it's wrong to inject people with experimental vaccines? What about people who know it's wrong and are speaking up now about that and being ignored, right? Like this guy making this argument saying like they should have known back then that it's wrong and they should have stopped it. Okay, you're going to stand in front of a freight train and stop that? It's the same reason why I'm saying now it's almost better to adopt gray man tactics, right? Go to the vaccine center with a tennis ball and a tenner and say, hey, maybe more than a tenner, and say, hey, can you inject me with my vaccine, please? My nice little vaccine here, my tennis ball, right? Gray man tactics, and do what you can to stay safe, because in this environment, the reality doesn't work. People have like having an argument based in the reality of the world does not work. They don't care. They care about how good it makes them feel to shame other people about not believing what they believe, exactly what they believe, right? And so I think that this is irresponsible of the NDP leader. I think it's irresponsible of other people who are applauding the NDP leader for doing this. It was the expressed intent to remove the Indian in the child. I don't know if there were documents that had language like that, but again, context matters. If you're trying to remove the Indian in the child, the replacement was meant to modernize the culture and bring everybody into the modern world, because being in the modern world was in vogue then. It was the right thing to do, right? Regardless, I'm not excusing the methods. I think the methods are horrific, and I've said that before. But I think that it is horrific, more horrific, to politicize this to this extent. Again, because we're re-traumatizing. We're creating a situation of national trauma when we've had multiple apologies about this already. Money spent. Well, we'll talk about that in the next segment. And that's not to say there's money spent, so get over it. But at a certain point, okay, here's an example. If you sold a house in the year 2000, okay, and you sold it for $100,000, let's just say, that same house right now, in 21 years later, is going to cost more than the $100,000 that you sold it from, right? So did you get a bad deal because you settled then and not now? Are you entitled to the difference in the value of your home because you sold it then and not now? Right? Because you made a mistake and you didn't want to sell it maybe then? You should have sold it now? Like, does that make a lot of sense? What about the inflationary impacts, right? You could buy more in 2000 with less money. So, right? Like, at what point is the deal done? At what point do we say, you know what, we've had enough time to, like, we're in the modern world now, blah, 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 blah. And people saying we need to repeal the Indian Act and get rid of it. Lots of First Nations people say that. Lots of Indigenous people say that. Jody Wilson-Raybould wrote a book about that. Maxime Bernier has a plank about that. We need to get rid of the Indian Act. At what point did you get a bad deal selling your house in 2000, right? At what point can we say this is done now? Like, we're not going to relitigate this. We litigated this. We paid it out. We said sorry. We had prime ministers say sorry. What else? What else is going to fix this, right? Black Lives Matter. This is not that, right? And there's a whole lot.